very much, Deputy President. Just when you think this Labor government cannot get any more incompetent or they can't stuff up any other government programs, they manage to exceed our very low expectations. And this third Albanese government budget, the third in 2 years, is no exception to that. And in fact, having a look at some of the detail now in relation to my home state of Western Australia, and it is another complete disaster for Western Australians. And it is very clear, very sadly, that Western Australians will be even worse off under this government than they were 2 years ago when they came into government. So what is very clear is that West Australians, like all Australians, will be paying the price for Labor's disastrous policies and also for their appallingly bad decisions. So, their policies in this budget, their third budget, continue to be highly inflationary, disastrously so and unnecessarily so. The cost of living for all Australians is up, energy prices are up, mortgages are up, groceries are up, and so the list of expenses that are going up for family households continues to increase. Now, Labor had the chance to address the pain that West Australians' households are already feeling as a consequence of these last two budgets in this third budget. But sadly, they squibbed and they failed very basic economic tests, as the media today has picked up right across TV, newspapers and online articles. The verdict is very, very clear. So why are they doing this? Apart from clear incompetence, they're very, very clearly trying to manufacture an artificial interest rate cut before the end of this year in a desperate attempt to save themselves at the next election. This is clearly a budget election which will leave disastrous deficits for this and the next generation to fill over coming years. So in these challenging economic times, which partially have been engineered by those opposite, we needed a budget that goes back to basics. But instead Labor is spending over $315 billion extra, which will, despite their attempts for an election, lower inflation and lower interest rate result, this is clearly inflationary. So what does this mean for Australian householders who are already struggling? This means less spending opportunities for household budgets and, most likely, increased mortgage repayments. So in Western Australia, I'm constantly hearing, wherever I go, from people about the stress on their household budgets and their concerns about cost of living increases, including the 12 interest rate rises since this mob have been in government. Now, after 3 Labor budgets, the average Australian household with a mortgage is over $35,000 a year worse off. And instead of making things better, they have only made things worse. Now, the budget last night confirmed that the unprecedented increase in net migration. Remember, we've heard so much from those opposite. Yes, well, we're a bit sorry. We did open the floodgates a bit too fast. We didn't think about housing, but it is a bit of an issue. But when you have a look at the budget figures last night, the increase in net migration is 1.67 million new migrants coming to our country over the next 5 years. Now, that wouldn't be so bad if the government hadn't forgotten to work with state and territory governments to create enough housing for all of these new migrants so that Australians, one, would be able to afford to buy a new house if they can find one and get a mortgage, but also so Australians could rent. So the question that remains unanswered is, where are these new migrants going to live? And what will be the additional impact on Australians in terms of their mortgage, unable to find a house, not only land to build on and actually have a house built within 3-4 years, but there is just simply not the rental stock available for people who are already here, and then for the new 1.67 million migrants who they want to come to Australia. Now, Labor has unashamedly fuelled this housing and rental crisis through migration when housing approvals are at an 11-year low. It just does not make sense. Now, in Western Australia, in fact, we have the second lowest quarterly level of new housing starts since records began 40 years ago. And I hear so many stories of desperate families visiting home opens, searching for rentals, only to be competing with large groups of people who are competing for the same very limited housing supply. And net migration will be increasing in Western Australia over the forward estimates over the time of the 1.67 million people coming to Australia, and they will be coming to Western Australia. Net migration is increasing in Western Australia more than any other state, and it is a complete disgrace that the state and federal governments have not stopped to think about this and take action that will work. And according to REWA, the demand for housing will continue to outstrip supply in Western Australia because we've now got, as I've said, the largest annual growth since 2009. Another shocking discovery in last night's budget is the $1.4 billion extra funding for the WA government's disastrous Metronet project. Those in Western Australia will remember 7 years ago, Labor came into government saying they were going to build even more train lines in Western Australia. 7 years later, the original budget has gone from $4.8 billion to over $12.5 billion. And again, the state government that has rivers of gold have now had to be bailed out by the federal Labor government. And guess what? In 7 years, there has not been a single train on a single train track yet to operate. I mean, how incompetent is that? So at a time when we need responsible economic management, the Albanese-Labor government has yet again had to bail out the most incompetent state government in the history of Western Australia. Now, in the time remaining, I'd like to talk about another disastrous decision that is having absolutely disastrous consequences on Western Australians, and that is the Albanese-Labor government's decision to ban live exports of sheep from Western Australia. It is very clear that this is a knee-jerk reaction that is done with the encouragement and engagement of animal welfare organisations on the East Coast who have no regard whatsoever for the welfare of the sheep, and also that will be still exported to our markets overseas, but also they have no regard whatsoever to the thousands and thousands of not only farmers but the local communities who rely on this industry. And I kid you not, get this, the brilliant Labor state government has said, not a problem, we don't really like it, but we're not going to fight it, we're not going to stand up to the Albanese government. But we're going to encourage, get this everybody, we're going to encourage these sheep farmers to actually start selling and to farming alternative protein. So grasshoppers, tofu and plant-based meat. Can you imagine us going to the Middle East markets and saying, we're not going to sell you lamb anymore, but why don't you buy these crickets instead? I mean, it is just insane, because you know where they're going to go. The farmers, instead of our overseas markets, instead of buying from West Australian farmers who now have the highest animal welfare standards in the world, but instead they will be going to countries such as Sudan, South Africa and Ethiopia, where they do not have the same, anywhere near the same, animal welfare standards that we now have. So if those opposite, if the Greens and if the Labor Party and if the animal activists who were working with you to get this ban actually cared about the welfare of sheep, you would actually be supporting the Australian industry, because the mortality rate of Australian sheep before reaching their destination has gone from 0.53 in 2018 to less than 0.17%. And we now have the best standards, and thanks to those opposite and the so-called animal welfare lobby, not only are you going to kill the jobs and the livelihoods of thousands of West Australian families and farming communities, but you are going to now condemn millions more sheep to death because they will come from countries that do not have the same animal standards. It is inexplicable, and shame on you all.